Yeah.
Deve solo spingere. Okay.
Chiaro?
Okay.
Yes, and
This
you
is when
speak.
this is turned on.
Buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning to all of you, and thank you very much for being here. This morning, we will be tackling a very important subject, which is nutrition, and what our approach to food should be. It's an important subject because it concerns the health of citizens and the entire system in which we live. Apart from health issues, food and nutrition have to do with the environment, but also the economy. Suffice it to mention that most European member states' budgets have sections in them which are money spent to help people recover from illnesses. Perhaps I could briefly explain what my experience has been over the past 2 years here in the European Parliament. I think that it is important, particularly for those of us who are fortunate enough to represent citizens in the institutions, I think it's important to have a long-term vision. A long-term vision which must think big, which has to move away from mechanisms which we are tied to, which lead us, of course, to take steps in the right direction, but very often those steps are isolated and they're not connected to each other. What we have to break is this link which we think is going to help us move quickly, but which does the exact opposite. So today, this is what we would like to have a debate on. Now, I know that it isn't easy to progress here because we are caught in a system which is tying us down, which has been built over the years and which has been feeding, in the economic sense of the word, feeding very large lobbies, but an entire economy which has been founded on this type of basis. So we, in the institutions, have a duty, which is to help change take place. In order to do that, we have to move away from these set mechanisms and create a different economy, a far stronger economy, which will place at its heart citizens and their health and well-being. And then in turn, the environment, the economy, social aspects, and so on and so forth will then improve also. So thank you very much for being here today. I hope that we will have a good, heated debate on the subjects which we put to you, and I'll pass the floor over to Eleonora Evi, who also very much believes in these necessary changes and has helped organize this event. Thank you.
Sì, buongiorno.
Good morning to all of you. I too am very pleased to be here today and to have organized this event, which we believe to be very important. And as Marco was saying, the whole idea is to lay the foundations for this change, to foster a debate on these topics, which unfortunately have been put to one side for too long and which have not been given the attention they deserve. I see my colleague Stefano from the GUI group here in the room. We organized another film viewing conspiracy here at the European Parliament, and this was another opportunity to draw people's attention to these necessary changes. These changes have to do with many different aspects of our daily lives, including a type of nutrition which would have less of a burden on the environment and create less environmental pollution, for instance. This is another aspect which we have discussed. Unfortunately, that topic has not been given the appropriate attention either. We here in the institutions are trying to convey these messages, which are very much in favor of renewal. We're trying to get a debate going for a number of reasons, including the fact that we see that certain choices are made, certain policies are implemented, which disregard this phenomenon of these aspects, and which are based on old ideas whereby, for instance, free trade has become a dogma, a type of mantra. And here I'm thinking of the free trade treaty which is being negotiated with the United States, which clearly includes many rather insidious dangers. There's a chapter on agri-food, which is a very important one, because it does have a certain influence on certain interests, which are major interests for some. So we're trying to think about all of this. We want to pause to reflect on what Europe has done, what it needs to do in the future. And I'm also thinking of recent legislation which has just been passed on novel food, for instance. And to a certain extent, this is paving the way again towards industrial interests, as opposed to what our real objective should be, which is the protection of our health. So this is the message which we want to convey. We want Parliament to hear what we're saying. I've seen that there are a number of events being organized in the Parliament at the moment, such as sustainable meat. Well, I think that this is really an oxymoron. You can't really raise cattle in this way. These are old ideas and preconceived ideas, and we really have to think and talk about alternatives. They do exist. There are alternatives which are feasible. Some people perhaps say that they're simple, they're economical, and perhaps this is explained in too simplistic a fashion. But it is possible to change. And the financial and economic arguments are the ones which seem to attract financial corporations more than anything else. So could I pass the floor over to Madame Signorelli, who will be introducing B for Eat? I would just like to say that this is a session which is an information session. We want to share information. That's our first objective, because somebody who is aware, somebody who is informed, can then go on to make the appropriate choices. So I'll pass the floor over to Nicola. She's a freelance journalist. She's copywriter for a number of journals and newspapers. Since she discovered the China study, she decided to ensure that Colin Campbell's views were heard, and she decided to set up B for Eat as well. Well, thank you. I'd like to thank the 5-Star Movement. I would like to thank Mr. Zullo and Madam Evi for having invited us here today. B for Eat. Well, I'm not really the founder of B for Eat. I am the spokesperson of 38,000 Italians who are all wondering about the same things, and many Europeans are as well. What can we do? What can we do with our food every time we go to do the shopping? It's a whole revolution which is taking place. And B for Eat, just like the 5-Star Movement, wishes to inform individuals as to what we're doing and what we can do. Professor Colin Campbell has taught us a lot here, because he's a researcher, he's a scientist, He can support his arguments, therefore, in a scientific fashion. And he's very humble in his approach. He suggests that we should all work together. Now, there are 30,000 Italians in this movement, but many Europeans can join our ranks because real change cannot be top down. It must be the opposite. We must involve the grassroots first. We must involve our neighbors, the people who are close to us, our relatives, for instance, people who can then go out and check out what they've heard and start changing. That's how you really start to change. It's important, therefore, that this be done in Europe, in the European Parliament. There's some encouragement, therefore, is being given to this movement. It's a movement which is based on the population, on the grassroots, but it's going all the way up to doctor's surgery. So when a patient comes along to a doctor and says, what should I do? The doctor must reply, and it's important to know what to say. So it's important, therefore, that those who are supposed to reply to the population be informed and be trained in the appropriate fashion. This is why we have to unite our strengths so that the simple messages get through. They're scientific, they're very clear-cut. People can't just avoid communicating with other people, because if this is not done, it is impossible to pass on the message. And I'd like to thank, therefore, the Five Star Movement for helping us to progress in this great project of ours. So could I turn to my husband, Marco Fiorese, who's chair of B4EAT, and he will just say a few words about what we can do, not just in Italy, but also in Europe. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you, Nicola. I'd also like to thank the Five Star Movement. I'd like to thank Marco Zullo and Eleonora Evi, because they really have put a lot of energy into this, and they're the only ones who've actually done something practical so far in order to spread the message of Colin Campbell and the message in the China study. I just wanted to say hello. When Nicola and I started work on spreading this message and started organising this event, and we started off in 2012. We didn't imagine that we would create a movement like this. It's a movement that's flourished, and we started with the grassroots, and we've learned here from our teacher, Professor Colin Campbell. We started with the grassroots, and we try to remain a grassroots movement. So I'd like to launch an appeal. All of you can do something. You can do your own bit at work or at university. You could, if you want to do something with us, fine, or do something on your own, fine. The important thing is to pass this message on, because science, the results of science have to be available to everyone. It's not right that the results of scientific studies just remain shut in a drawer somewhere. Obviously, there are lots of economic interests involved, as we've seen in the film that was shown this morning, but your role could be whatever work you do, whatever country you come from. I just want to tell you that our movement has started in Italy, but we do want to spread to every single member state, and we want you to sort of copy the format that we've used. Thank you very much. And now I'll give the floor to our keynote speaker, Professor Colin Campbell.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I first want to express my appreciation for the interest and attendance of all of you. I very much appreciate that. I also would like to thank also Marco Zullo and Eleonora Ebe for making this arrangement and for the invitation, and of course with my good friends Nicola Signorelli and Marco Polo. Without those four, I would not be here, and I very much appreciate that. Thank you. My topic, as they mentioned, is nutrition. I've been in this field a long time. I'm especially interested in speaking about the science of nutrition and the kind of evidence that supports this particular point of view that I will be discussing here. I have learned over the years that nutrition, although confusing for many people, actually has more to offer than I could have ever imagined. So I'm going to start out with a hypothesis, namely, nutrition can prevent and treat disease more effectively than all the pills and procedures combined. I know that's a very strong statement, but I really believe this is true. If that's the case, then why is nutrition not recognized as a medical specialty? That is true certainly in the United States, and I think it's largely true in Europe as well. I started my research career many years ago, 60 years ago, at Cornell University. And I started with a personal bias, and I need to share that with you. My interest was actually promoting a greater consumption of animal protein as a nutrient. I came from a farm. I was raised on a farm milking cows. This is me here on a combine that threshes grain. When I went away to graduate school, I did my doctoral dissertation on promoting animal protein consumption. I wanted to know with my professors how we might be able to do that more efficiently. I also need to share with you the fact that the research funding that I received for this work over the years all came from the public taxpayer in the United States, principally the U.S. National Cancer Institute of the National Institutes of Health, or NIH. Also, we received some funding from the American Cancer Society and the American Institute for Cancer Research. We received no funding from the corporate sector, which put me in a nice position of being able to just watch the data as it developed. So, why is nutrition so confusing? I think many of you will probably agree that we have many different opinions about this. And so I want to raise this question. Why is nutrition so confusing for the lay public as well as for professionals? One of the reasons for this, in my view, is that nutrition research funding is almost non-existent in our major funding agencies. For example, of the 28 National Institutes of Health in the United States, which funded most of my work, of the 28 National Institutes of Health, we have one for heart disease, one for cancer, or one for diabetes, so forth and so on. We don't have a single institute called the National Institute of Nutrition. So nutrition is not held in very high regard. Also, nutrition education is missing in medical school training. It's certainly true for all the medical schools in the United States, and I think it's largely true here in Europe as well. Now, for my research, as I said, having started out from one point of view, I now have a very different point of view, and so I want to share with you my story. How did I get to the kind of evidence that I now find so persuasive? In the middle 1960s, we were well aware in the Western world there was a so-called protein gap. People, especially in the developing countries, needed more protein, especially children, and now malnourished children. So the first position I had with my senior colleague was organizing a nationwide program for feeding malnourished children in the Philippines. And we wanted to make sure they got enough protein, like we do in the West. That was the principal interest that we had at the time. However, while doing that work, I came across a rather peculiar and strange observation. It was anecdotal. In other words, this was not published. It was something I just heard from my colleagues. Namely, that although the majority of the Filipinos consume less protein than we did in the West, there were a few families who were consuming the most protein. Unfortunately, it appeared to me that those families were the families who had children more likely to get liver cancer. Obviously, that was very strange. We're in the Philippines trying to present more protein to the population, but in reality, we're seeing some evidence that it might be associated with liver cancer in children. Then this study came from India. And this was a study with experimental animals, where they basically were studying the causes of liver cancer in the experimental animals. And their hypothesis was higher protein should protect against the liver cancer. They got these results, which you can see here. The animals given the 20% dietary protein, that's the usual levels, 100% of these animals got the liver cancer when they were exposed to a carcinogen. Animals given less protein, 5%, the same amount of carcinogen, they got no cancer. So here's a case where increasing protein, increasing cancer. Very dramatic results. And exactly the opposite what I would have thought, and the opposite, in fact, what they themselves thought when they made the hypothesis. So then this was an opportunity for me to ask the question, why do we get these kind of results? I think we're seeing this in humans, certainly it's true in experimental animals, and so that organized an opportunity for me to get research funding from NIH. The name of the first grant that I got that was then to continue for the next 27 years was simply focused on the idea, how does this chemical cause cancer? How does this chemical cause liver cancer in particular? And I was interested in using various factors, dietary factors, to change the rate of cancer, because by doing that, we could understand more about the cancer mechanism. So this was the title of my research. So I want to share with you just a very small sample of some of the results, just to illustrate what we saw. In this first case, we had two groups of animals. Both groups had been exposed to a chemical carcinogen. One group given 20% dietary protein, the other 5%, just like the Indian workers had done. You can see here that for early cancer, first 12 weeks, the animals given the 20% protein, the cancer were growing very well. The animals given 5% protein, they did not grow at all, even though they had been exposed to the chemical carcinogen. Really quite dramatic. So then we tried many different ways of exploring this relationship. Here's one example. We wanted to see if we could switch the diet from one to another diet, what would happen. We started with 20% dietary protein. You can see the cancers are growing. We switched to 5%. We turned them off. 20% turned on. 5% turned off. In other words, we got to a place where we could actually control cancer by nutritional means, in this particular case with protein. So I consider this really a provocative, rather striking result. Namely, development of cancer could be turned on and off by nutritional means. Prior to this time, this really hadn't been demonstrated in research in the scientific community. I found it very exciting. I found it particularly interesting that we could actually turn on the cancer, like we anticipated, by higher protein diets. Another related idea, we learned too from this kind of evidence that it might be possible to actually reverse cancer simply by changing the level of nutrient intake. So now I want to describe to you basically some of the fundamental science that's involved in this. When we see something like this, it's very provocative, unusual. We need to know what is the mechanism? How does it work at the biochemical level? We study cancer usually in research by considering 3 stages of cancer: initiation, promotion, and progression. I'm going to share with you some ideas of looking for the mechanism that was responsible for the protein turning on cancer. I presumed, as did my colleagues, that we would find the main mechanism by which protein was causing cancer. If there was such a mechanism, maybe we could make a drug to prevent it, for example. So the question is, what is the mechanism? In the first stage of this cancer development, initiation stage, we explored several different opportunities, several different possible mechanisms. We studied, for example, the rate at which the carcinogen goes into the cell as a function of protein intake. We looked at the enzyme responsible for changing the carcinogen into a product that then could cause cancer. We explored the extent to which that product actually bound to the gene to cause mutations. Mutations is the starting place for cancer. Now I can't explain all these details, but I want to share with you a different way of looking at this question. Normally, when cancer starts, a carcinogen from outside of the cell enters the cell. When it comes to the inside of the cell, it's metabolized by an enzyme that converts it to a product. In this case, it metabolizes it to a product, a carcinogen epoxide, which is very reactive. That in turn then binds covalently, chemically, it binds to the DNA of the gene. That's the normal sequence of events involved in this first stage of cancer formation. We wanted to know what effect does this dietary protein have on any of these steps. So I'm going to show you here the effects of the high protein diet on different steps along the way. First off, we learned that the high protein diet increased the amount of carcinogen coming into the cell. It can increase the rate at which it entered the cell. The second thing, the high protein diet increased the amount of that enzyme, the mixed function or MFO enzyme, and increased the amount of enzyme so it could speed up the conversion of the carcinogen. The third thing, it changed the character of the enzyme. So it became more efficient in converting the carcinogen to the product that bound to eventually to the DNA. Then finally, a fourth possible mechanism, we found the high protein diet actually increased the ability of this very reactive product to bind to the DNA. That's the cDNA. And when it binds to the DNA, it damages the DNA. So this is the initiation step. The carcinogen comes in, gets changed to a product that then binds to the DNA and causes damage. So here's a summary of what I just said. 4 possible mechanisms involved in this first stage from carcinogen to the DNA of the gene. Normally, in our cells, this idea of chemicals binding to our DNA is happening all the time. However, normally, our body is very efficient of repairing that damage. We call it DNA repair. That's the normal circumstance. The cells are always working to repair any of this possible damage. What we learned when we looked at that mechanism, the protein, very curiously, the high protein diet blocked that mechanism. So here's our normal defense mechanism against this. The protein is intercepting. So now we have 5 steps where the high protein diet is causing problems. 4 of the steps is pushing it forward. 1 step is blocking the system that corrects that forward motion. That's initiation. Now I want to consider with you the second stage. Several mechanisms here were also possible to consider. Basically, we also should say, based on the slide I showed you before, that second stage is reversible. That's reversible. And incidentally, I'm really going to offer the idea that cancer can be reversed for other kinds of cancer as well. So Okay, initiation, repair is being blocked. So when that repair is blocked, now we're going to form some early cancer cells. At that point, our body normally still has the capability of using the immune system to kill those cells. It uses cells called natural killer cells for obvious reasons. So our body forms these natural killer cells and kills the early cancer cells. That's the normal state. Interestingly, the high protein diet blocked that ability too. So now we have 6 mechanisms. 4 are turned on in cancer, 2 are blocking the repair mechanisms. And then in the subsequent stages, we looked at 4 more different possible mechanisms having to do with the rate at which cells divide and having to do with the amount of reactive oxygen species we say to put it forward. And so we have 10 mechanisms. This took about 12 to 13 years. This is extensive research to work this out. But of those 10 mechanisms we looked at, none seemed to be specially responsible for the high protein effect. I didn't know. I couldn't identify which mechanism was the most important. Every single mechanism, 4 are going forward, 2 are trying to go backwards. Every single case, the high protein diet was blocking or enhancing those reactions to give more cancer. There's incidentally, from a statistical point of view, there's only one chance, theoretically in 1,024, that this is a random event. So this was really convincing evidence for me. The high protein diet actually blocks in several stages, all at one time, this kind of forward motion. Now, this study became more provocative with time because the experimental protein we were using was casein. Casein is the main protein of cow's milk. It makes up about 85 to 87% of cow's milk. For me, coming from the farm, milking cows, this is a hard observation to accept. But nonetheless, there it was. So I was interested to find out what about other proteins? So we tried soy protein and wheat protein, for example, 2 plant proteins, fed at the 20% level of calories. It didn't do it. So now we're seeing something, this animal protein on the one hand, increasing cancer, plant proteins in contrast, essentially blocking it. Now I want to say that this work was published, I have to show this, it was published in the very best journals. I must say this because obviously it's a very provocative idea, something difficult to accept. But I just show here a quick list for those who may want to go back and check me out on some of these things. These are just some of the publications that we had in the scientific literature published in the very best journals of about 300 and some papers that I had at the time. Now let's move on to the next question. I talked about 5% blocking the cancer, 20% turning it on. So the question that we wanted to ask was, what about the individual, the levels in between? And so we've had an experiment that had 4% protein, 6%, 8%, 10%, and higher, 12, 14, and 20, for example. And what we saw was that in all these cases, even though they were exposed to a chemical carcinogen that gives liver cancer, protein could be fed up to a level of 10% and did not turn on the cancer. Only when the protein was in excess of 10% of total calories was the cancer turned on. So I have to change my statement a little bit. The protein just does not automatically turn on cancer. It turns on cancer when fed in excess of the amount apparently that is needed. We know that protein is an essential nutrient. We know that. Without protein, we would not be alive. So protein is an extremely important nutrient, but the question is, how much is enough? because if we exceed what we need, of course, in theory, we might expect some problems. Now, human consumption traditionally is from about 10 to 25% protein. So most of us, at least in the Western world, are consuming diets that have levels of protein in the area where we might expect some difficulties. That's a really interesting shape of a curve. It's kind of typical for different nutrients to do that. You see a level where normal range, and too high we have problems, too low we have problems. This is just one half of that curve essentially. So I took that curve with a lot of other kinds of information that I don't have time to share here to show the idea that protein relates not just to cancer, but also relates to heart disease and diabetes and many other diseases in a similar way. That is, protein up to a certain level does not cause problems. But when protein is consumed in excess of the amount we need, that's when we begin to see problems. So the question arises, how does this relate to how much protein we need? How does it relate to the kind of protein we might be consuming? So the minimum amount of protein we need, and this was done many years ago, 75 to 80 years ago in science, has been repeated many times since. The minimum amount of protein we need is around 5 or 6% of total calories. When that was first learned many years ago, there was an interest to share this with the public. And so just to make sure that everybody got enough protein, it's very important, they increased it. They elevated it up to about 8 or 9%. That's called a recommended dietary allowance, RDA. I'm sure I've heard of that. Now, the RDA level of protein from this kind of curve suggests that's an ideal level of protein consumption. We're getting enough protein, it's very important, but it's not exceeding that level where we might expect to see problems. Unfortunately, the average protein intake in Western countries, I'm suggesting Europe, certainly the United States, is around 17 or 18% average. So a lot of us, as I mentioned before, are consuming levels of protein in excess of the amount we need. Now the question is, what kind of diet provides us with the good levels of protein without getting into some difficulty? Vegetables, fruits, grains, legumes, nuts and seeds possibly. A mixture of that kind of food has a protein content that actually easily provides all the protein we need. Plants have protein. For a long time in our history, many people thought protein only came from animal foods, from meat. Not true. Plants have protein, they have enough protein, and we do not need any more protein, if you agree with this concept. We consume more protein, basically, primarily by consuming animal-based food, meat, milk, eggs, and so forth. But when we do, if, for example, let's say we want total protein intake up around 18, 19% or something like that. We don't think about it this way, it just happens subconsciously. But if we want more protein because we think it's important, and that's been the history, we think it's important. We go and get the protein from the animal-based foods. Let's say we are now 18 or 19% protein. Because the amount of calories consumed determines how much food we eat. It's sort of a ceiling. When we start putting in animal foods to get the protein up to 18, 19%, we have to remember, we therefore are decreasing the consumption of the plant-based foods substantially. So when we decide to consume this high-protein animal-based food, we're creating two responses. Number one, we're increasing the likelihood of some damage. Number two, we're displacing the foods that really matter. Now, the question concerning what is the nutrient value of plant foods and animal foods? Plant foods, I've got listed here 5 groups of nutrients. Antioxidants. Antioxidants are the colored stuff in plants. They, as the name indicates, they block oxidation, excessive oxidation in our bodies. Excessive oxidation produces products that increases aging, increases cancer, increases heart disease. So antioxidants is an extremely important group of nutrients to consume because it blocks this. Complex carbohydrates, also very good, especially for the intestinal tract. So we need complex carbohydrates, antioxidants, vitamins. Actually, they're all made in plants. So when we're consuming plant-based foods, we get all the antioxidants and complex carbohydrates and vitamins we need. Vitamin A, by the way, can be obtained in animal foods, but it's not really the vitamin. The vitamin for vitamin A is beta-carotene, which is a precursor. But in any case, so plants have the good nutrients. Animals really don't have very much unless they ate the plants beforehand, before being slaughtered. Plants and animal foods both have fat and protein. Plants have about the right amount of fat and protein. Processed foods is another sort of category. I'm talking about using maybe even material from plants like sugar, refined flour, maybe some oil, and we make donuts and fancy things and pastries. So processed foods have a similar effect to animal-based foods in one respect. It's displacing the consumption of whole plant-based foods. So we have 3 groups of foods: whole plant-based foods, animal-based, and processed. Only one really provides the kind of information that actually causes a good response. Now, this leads to a generalized statement. Having gotten to this point in my career, and then having decided to write the China study with my son, who incidentally is a physician now in the United States, when we got to this point in telling this story, I was curious to know whether this information applied to any other diseases. I was especially curious to know whether there was something in the scientific literature maybe we missed. I suspected there were other things, I knew some things, but we did a systematic search. All these diseases listed here, a whole food, plant-based diet can prevent, suspend, that means slow it down, or actually cure these diseases. So some of these diseases are very serious. Some are more of the nuisance type, maybe. But it's really interesting. There's this whole food, plant-based diet, everything working together actually can have this kind of effect. So here's an idea. The whole food, plant-based diet effect is broad. Very important. Because our current medical model suggests that we should look at one thing at a time, or one mechanism. This thing is very broad across the whole thing. It's also very rapid. I will show you some information in a moment that when people start eating this way, things change very quickly. If this dietary change is sustained, this is not like a drug. You take it today and then go back and do something different tomorrow. If this is sustained over time, then we find that it has this broad effect. It not only prevents future disease, it actually now can be used to treat existing disease in most cases. Really quite remarkable. And of the entire story that I'm telling here, I suggest that may be the single most important piece of information. And that is this kind of whole food, plant-based diet actually can be used to treat existing illness. It's the first line of offering information to someone who may be having difficulties. So here's my definition. Again, as I said in the beginning, a whole food, plant-based diet with little or no added fat, sugar, and salt solves more illnesses than all the pills and procedures combined. That's a thought to kind of think about. you'll really realize the significance of that the more you think about that, but it's a very powerful statement. Essentially, it's this. Now, having done this work in the laboratory, I was interested in the extent to which this applies to humans. We had an opportunity to do some work in China many years ago, about 35 years ago. The Chinese in the early 1980s were just reporting at that time how much cancer existed across the country for each of about 2,400 counties. The first senior scientist from China to come to the United States at that time came to my laboratory and worked with me, and so he, Dr. Chen, and I organized a study to go to China to survey the whole country, to see why is it that in this case, for example, breast cancer is very common in some areas and much less common in other areas. The Chinese had also given us information on other cancers as well. So we had a group of cancers, and we looked at distribution. We organized a study to do a survey of a total of 130 villages across China. We collected all kinds of information to ask this question. What is in the environment, what is in the food that actually might cause these diseases? There's many different ways I could describe this, but this is one way that I found a little more interesting. It turns out that of all the diseases in China, and incidentally, the Chinese government gave to us more information on the non-cancer diseases, like pneumonia, the infectious diseases. We had access to the death rates for two different kinds of diseases. One's associated with the poor areas, the ones associated with the more affluent, richer areas. Look on the right-hand side. That's cancer, different kinds of cancers, diabetes, coronary heart disease. Those are the kind of diseases that we saw clustered together in similar regions in China, geographically. We see more in certain areas. So we could ask the question, why is that so? Is there something biological here? Is there something political or geographic or economic? We had an opportunity to look at these kinds of questions. And so we had access to a huge amount of information, and the thing that was most related to that was higher blood cholesterol levels. Really interesting, because blood cholesterol is an indication of a risk for heart disease. It also is an indication of a risk for cancer. And in China, what we saw, we compare all these counties, as cholesterol started to go up, we see more and more heart disease and cancer and so forth. And so blood cholesterol was correlated, as we say, with that group of diseases. Just an indication. It's not necessarily the cause of anything, but it's a good indication of the risk for disease, a good indication of the kind of diets we're consuming. So cholesterol, in turn, you could ask the question, well, what causes cholesterol to go up? Actually, it turns out that it's animal protein. More than saturated fat, more than total fat like we hear in the West. This plasma urea nitrogen that you see here is another way of measuring risk, something like cholesterol. And those indicators are highly correlated with the emergence of Western diseases. So, as I say, it turns out that higher cholesterol levels are primarily determined by higher consumption of animal protein. This is an idea that was first discovered more than 100 years ago, in 1909. And for the next 15 years, there were several research groups that were actually establishing that animal protein is more important in increasing cholesterol than is cholesterol itself. But we forgot it. We forgot it. This was a summary of those early years, written in 1926. Here's a quote. Elevation of blood cholesterol is directly referable to the excess of protein in the diet, not to the dietary cholesterol. So we made a mistake of these last 100 years. It's really protein. It's really protein that increases the cholesterol levels, which in turn then is associated with the development of early heart disease. And two, cancer. Doesn't determine, it's not the cause necessarily, it's an indication of it. Later in 1940-41, it was found that casein, the protein we're using too, was 5 times greater than soy protein in its ability to stimulate the formation of early heart disease. Very interesting. 5-fold difference between casein and soy. And there's much other research I could show you, it published at that time, shows that animal protein, like they said 100 years ago, animal protein increases cholesterol levels and thereby increases the risk for heart disease, and cancer, and some other Western diseases. As I say, this is 75 years ago. This is an interesting question. You know, why did we forget some of these things in science over the years? It's an entirely different question. Every time something was shown about animal protein, for example, it was generally ignored. Also making this story in China interesting was that the range of cholesterol in China, the range of blood cholesterol in China is from a low of 90 up to 170. Their high was near our low in the United States. The average cholesterol in rural China was only 127, the average. The average in the United States is about 210, something I'm sure similar here in Europe too. So what this says is that the factors that cause cholesterol to increase in Western and American diets or Western diets, the dietary factors that cause that to go up, it turns out it's the same as it causes the cholesterol to go up in rural China. And so it covers a big, broad range of cholesterol experience. So increasing animal-based foods, protein included, of course, does that. This then led to awareness, I should say, of some research that was done by a colleague of mine, Cleveland Clinic, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn. Dr. Esselstyn and I didn't know each other at the time. In the late 1980s, he started a study with some seriously ill heart patients, only 18. But all these people had seriously ill heart disease. He put them on a diet, vegetables, fruits, and grains. Those people, in the 8 years prior to their enrollment in the study, they had 49 coronary events. They were sick people. They were seriously ill with heart disease. They went from 49 coronary events in the previous 8 years to 0 over the next 12 years. Dramatic. There's no pills, no procedures that can have that kind of effect. But it's a small study. He was criticized, rightfully so. That is a small study. We can't say too much about that. So then Dr. Esselstyn did a more recent study, published about a year ago. In this case, he has 196 patients that he has followed. They come to see him. He enrolls them in one 5-hour session, usually in groups of 5 to 12, and he spends a morning with them, with his wife, and he tells them, here, you eat this way, you do it this way, this way, this way. They all have heart disease. You say you do that, and we'll see what happens. So only one time did he meet with these patients. Then between 2 and 7 years later, he picks up the phone and he calls them. How are you doing? So they tell him whether or not they stayed with the diet and what experiences they had. 89% of the people who were told this the first time stayed with it. 89% is impressive. Of course, these people are, they're more inclined to want to stick with it because they have heart disease. But there's a good number. It turns out of the 89% of the people who continued on this diet, less than 1% had another heart disease event 2 to 7 years later. Only one individual. It was actually a friend of mine who I referred to Dr. Esselstyn. I learned later that he did not really comply as much as he thought he did, according to his wife. But in any case, less than 1% of these people had another heart disease event. Those who did not comply, they went and ate the regular diet, 62% had another heart attack or died. So once again, with this much larger study, this dietary effect, whole food, plant-based, has a dramatic effect on treating heart disease. Not just preventing it, actually treating it. My son, our oldest son, who actually was the director of the film that was just shown here, actually took groups of people as part of that film and gave them food for 10 days. And the first study that they did is just a sample of evidence. This is not published. But the first group that he had was 16 patients. Here's what generally happens. He's done this several times, and other colleagues have done the same thing. You take people, a group of people, you take blood samples in the beginning, you give them the food, then you measure thereafter. They lost 5 to 10 pounds. Total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, drops remarkably so, just in 10 days. Triglycerides, which is another indicator of so-called the lipid profile, again, look at that drop from 134 to 89. These are very strong effects in a very short period of time. And this is part of what's happening to these people who then go on and don't get heart disease. So this is a very early event. In terms of long-term practices, we now know that if you compare countries, a diet that is higher in animal protein consumption with all the other changes that go with it, higher animal protein consumption is just beautifully related to higher breast cancer risk. I would say this is evidence of long-term effects. So we got short-term effects, 10 days, middle-term effects, 10 to 20 years, and lifetime effects. All three cases, the higher protein diet is associated with, I should say higher animal protein diet, is associated with more disease risk. So effects of animal protein diets and short, mid, and long-term disease outcomes are consistent. So now I want to go back to the question about why we're so confused and why we have not heard this before. I say that we are too much focused in medicine and too much focused, again, in nutrition too, on thinking about one thing at a time, one chemical at a time. We try to determine what is the mechanism. I couldn't determine a mechanism. There is no such thing. But we focus on one mechanism because we do that to maybe make a drug. That's the basis for the drug industry. This is sort of the philosophical, scientific basis for the drug industry. Also, when we're doing this kind of research, we think about one outcome. We produce a drug for heart disease, not realizing, it might work for another disease. Drugs don't do that, by the way, very well, but the diet does all of them. So we think about, in research, one thing at a time. We make recommendations about diet based on one nutrient at a time. Hey, this is how much protein we need, this is how much vitamin C we need, and so forth and so on. So all of our thinking is very narrowly channeled on one thing at a time. We label foods the same way, one thing at a time. We actually measure the quality of food by how much nutrients they have of various and sundry things. We emphasize the use of single nutrients very much. In fact, we use nutrient supplements because we assume that if these nutrients are good in plants and we have an association between high or low of something, that it should relate. So we did some experiments over the last 30 years, lots of studies on this. Basically, unfortunately, the results are not good. In spite of all the research that's been done on micronutrient supplements, vitamin supplements, we now have evidence in a lot of cases that they don't work in most cases, and in fact, they can actually increase disease risk. Here's vitamin E increases hemorrhagic stroke by 74%. Calcium and vitamin D supplements increase cardiovascular events in some studies. Vitamin E increases risk of prostate cancer by 17% in yet another study. Just a sample. I'm just simply saying that when we use nutrient supplements to try to achieve what I'm describing here, it tends not to work. There's something different about putting a nutrient in a supplement compared to putting it in leave it in the food. I want to share with you one study. It was a joint study between American and Finnish scientists in the 1990s. It illustrates this point, I think, quite well. We knew at that time that smokers who get lung cancer because of a lot of excessive oxidation We knew at that time that if we could have some way to block the oxidation, it might reduce lung cancer. And beta-carotene, which is the provitamin A, was used. We saw, for example, in several studies that if you compare smokers, different levels of beta-carotene in the blood, the higher the beta-carotene in the blood, the lower the lung cancer rate. That's what we sort of knew. So this research was done to put the beta-carotene into a pill for the smokers. Maybe it should work. That was the idea. It turned out that there's a big study, 29,000 male smokers given beta-carotene supplements. And they were followed for the next 5 to 8 years to see what would happen. It turned out the food beta-carotene that gets in the blood, it was inversely related with lung cancer. That is to say, you see that number there, minus 19%. That means as the food beta-carotene goes up, the lung cancer goes down, and it's significant. It's the same as what already was sort of known. Very interesting and significant. However, the supplement beta-carotene actually increased lung cancer. Exactly the opposite. So the nutrient in the supplement form did not do what it does in food. And there's some reasons for that, and I'll mention it in a few moments. So as I say, much of the confusion that we have in the Western world, in our medical practice and other places, we focus too much on individual events out of context. I call it reductionism. This is not my word. This is a word that has been used in science for a long time. But we focus on individual nutrients. We focus on individual mechanisms. And as I said, I'm learning that there is no such thing as a single mechanism. Maybe we can stop one mechanism. Maybe in the short run we can see something that might look good. But nature is much more powerful than that, because there are lots of mechanisms we've got to think about. We think about outcomes, one outcome at a time. So instead of reductionism, which is typically found in nutrition circles and medical circles, what's the opposite of that? I like this word here, holism, with a W, where things are working together. In order to get some understanding of what this means, I suggest we take a look at the cell. Here's a picture of a cell. This is the basic unit of biology. Long time we thought that. Every cell is like a universe in terms of its complexity, in terms of the amazing number of infinite numbers of mechanisms that operate in that cell. We have between 10 and 100 trillion cells in our body. We can't even imagine, we can't comprehend that number. Each cell, not visible, can easily sit on the head of a pin. Just imagine, maybe upwards of 100 trillion cells, and we can't see any of them. But each cell is like a universe. And each cell has a whole universe of reactions, biochemical reactions. Just almost infinite varieties of reactions going on. Years ago, when I was teaching biochemistry, for a biochemistry class, we were excited and fascinated by the idea that we could talk about metabolism. We start out with sugar up at the top, and maybe some of you have seen this. It gets converted down through the pathway, and finally it comes to, that's called glycolysis. Finally, it comes to the second stage, which is the Krebs cycle. Really gets a lot of, what's really happening here, the carbohydrate substrate in the beginning is giving up its energy at different stages along the way. So this is what we thought was interesting. Everybody in sort of biochemistry in those days were putting on charts on the wall, and so somebody comes along and finds another reaction. After some time, we got this. Now we're at a stage where all those reactions, many of them have been discovered. How in the world can we actually deal with one of those reactions that might relate, let's say, to a disease? Especially, how can we just treat one mechanism at a time and really know what the consequences are? So this is my concept of holism. I could spend days and days talking about this. I find the concept very exciting. The holistic idea operates not just in the cells, it operates in colonies of cells. It operates within organs. It operates between us and with each other. It operates at many different levels. We don't seem to understand this concept because we misunderstand nutrition. We misunderstand nutrition. Nutrition, we think of one thing at a time, as I said. It's basically driven by the corporate profit motive. We have excessive medical care costs. This is worse in the United States. We have the highest per capita costs, medical care costs of any country in the world. We are about 2 to 3 times higher than most European countries. It's horrible. So we spend a lot of money on medical care. We also are number 1 in the use of drugs. So you begin to see what the problem is. Eating this way, if we ate this way, we reduce medical care costs in the United States, and some of us made estimates, we could reduce medical care costs by 70 to 80%. That's a lot, just by deciding what to eat. Also, eating the wrong food like we do creates unnecessary violence. And I'm talking about unnecessary violence against other sentient beings as well as the unnecessary violence that actually begins to involve people and environmental issues. We do inappropriate research because we don't understand nutrition. We design studies to sort of support some idea that we may have. By doing this, one thing at a time, it gives ample opportunity for corruption, I would suggest. Maybe a strong word, but I'm talking about the misuse of information, at the policy level to make some point that we may be preferring. We also know, of course, that not understanding nutrition compromises our health. And the biggest one, one of the biggest ones, is environmental degradation. We now know, and this is supported by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, located in Rome. I've spoken there incidentally about this. We now know that the food we choose to eat is the single most important factor involved in climate change, involved in soil loss, involved in global warming. Food, the food we choose to eat is more important than all the transportation and contribution to environment put together. So we are, in fact, on basis of environmental data that we now have, we're in a difficult time. We've got to deal with that problem, and I'm going to suggest, and my colleagues elsewhere at the World Bank and some at the United Nations and other places, we're suggesting the primary place to go at the moment, change the food we eat. Because for one thing, the gases released are different and they dissipate faster from the environment besides. So some quick summary observations. Cancer experimentally can be reversed by low-protein diets. Heart disease can be cured by low-protein diets. Type 2 diabetes is resolved by low-protein diets within a matter of a week or 2. Type 1 diabetes, where you need medications, even there, we're now knowing you can reduce medications substantially by using a whole food plant-based diet. This is a topic I have not gotten into. I should say all biological events begin with genes, sometimes bad genes, sometimes good genes. They're not responsible for disease risk, even though we're putting a lot of effort on that question. It's not the genes we have that gives us rise to the disease in the vast majority of cases. It's what controls the expression of these genes, and that's nutrition. One of the primary focuses of nutrition. Plant-based diets turns on the good genes and turns off the bad genes. You may have seen that in previous stuff I was showing you. Nutrient supplements at best is a poor choice for delivering information. Here's a word or a phrase that's popular these days, especially for those who are developing drugs. They talk about targeted drug therapy. Targeted drug therapy is what I'm criticizing. The idea is, and it sounds like good science, let's find out what is the mechanism for some problem. Let's make a chemical in it so we can use that chemical, a drug, to target that mechanism. That's the idea. I'm saying no. That is a really rather foolish, superficial idea. And it can only lead to unintended consequences like side effects, for example. So targeted drug therapy is not the panacea for disease control. nutrition is. I also should add, obviously there's some drugs that we can use that will do for us what we need to have done in the short term. That's very clear. But our excessive use of drugs for everything under the sun is not appropriate. Gene therapy is not the panacea for disease control. Nutrition is. Chemoprevention as a word was invented to focus on the idea that chemicals can prevent. No, that's a bad word. That was the basis for the nutrient supplement industry. We know that doesn't work. So I'm saying with this idea, which I consider to be, quite frankly, almost a revolutionary idea, we can do so much with this. And we have the evidence. It's no longer now, it's now not possible for people to argue that we have other kinds of evidence for another kind of approach. This evidence is really substantial. And so I'm saying, to me, it tends to suggest maybe there's something from the past that we should have paid attention to. Aristotle said, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I love that idea. And I'm sure many of you are very much aware and familiar with that concept. Things working together produce so much more than they do as individual entities. It's very clear. I think Aristotle really knew what he was talking about. Hippocrates even added to that. Let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food. Again, a very bright idea. We forgot it. And so what I'm suggesting, now that we understand this holistic concept and we understand and we have demonstrations now of what can happen, it's food. It's pure and simple, it's food. And it's understanding nutrition. That is not taught in medical schools. Do you see the problem here? It's a very serious issue. So we've got to find ways to be able to penetrate the public, enable the public to actually know this information so that at least they can be aware and make their own choices. As I say, this was told in this book that I published in 2013. I'll just finish off this. One of the things I say, we need training in medical schools. We do have an online course at Cornell that's been going on for some time. We offer continuing medical education credits. What we're trying to do in this course is to offer the best possible scientific basis for nutrition because it's that important. And there are others offering similar things too, and I'm delighted to see different groups beginning to really get into this. B4Eat obviously is doing this kind of work, and so it's also true with some other places. But my point of view on this is that whatever it is, we have an opportunity to go to medical schools and offer them really substantially good information if we do it right so that they in turn can use it appropriately. This is the China study that was published. Many of you know about, I know. So thank you so much for your attention. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Campbell, for all those interesting ideas. And I'd also like to thank Nicola. Moreover, Professor Campbell this morning was able to meet the Health Commissioner, Mr. Andrew Kaitje. The debate was very interesting. It's been much more interesting than what we're used to sometimes. But anyway, before I open the floor for questions, I'd like to stress the importance of a global approach. Professor Campbell did look at a scientific study of diseases and the interface between diet and disease, but I think there's a political angle we should take here. I don't think we should expect a real change or fundamental change if only part of society changes. Obviously, if part of society changes, that can be an incentive, but I think what we need is a global change. And so I think, as it's been said, it's important that each one of us, wherever they work, whatever institution they work for, all of us should be taking certain choices, launching certain actions, will be exemplary in nature, set an example for others, which will then lead to broader change. Having said that, I'll open the floor for questions. We've got about half an hour, and I'll take 2 or 3 questions together, and then we'll have some time for replies. So I'd ask whoever takes the floor to introduce themselves. Could you introduce yourself? Good morning. I'm Giuseppe Berghini from Verona. Good morning, Professor. You don't need to stand up. I would like to ask the following question. I'd like to know your opinion on the use of vitamin C as a possible anti-tumor therapy, given that Dr. Linus Pauling, since the 1970s, has been maintaining that high doses of ascorbic acid can prevent or treat many tumours. Thank you very much. I come from Venice. I'd like to ask a question. I'd like to know from the other 2 colleagues whether people make changes, have you thought about launching programs for schools, for children, so that children can then become used to certain ideas? I know that young people will be made aware about environmentalism and about nutrition and about healthy eating. Have you thought about launching educational programs? Okay, let's collect a few questions together, and then we'll get the replies. Thank you very much, Massimo Bonucci. Thank you, first of all, Professor Campbell. I'd like to thank Professor Campbell for having raised this food problem as a source of many diseases, and he has focused on neoplasia. And I think we have to think about the basic therapy for that. I don't think you can say to a patient anymore, eat what you like, because according to the data, I think we can see that there is a basis for an antiblastic therapy and nutrition. But a more specific question, which I think will help move on to another question again. As you've said, that 20% increase in the protein consumption, animal protein consumption, would then actually be a trigger off for proliferation of tumours. Well, I'd like to know why, in your view, the concept of vegetal proteins doesn't have the same trigger effect. What's the substantive difference between the use of animal protein on the one hand and the use of vegetable protein on the other in the same quantities?
So, is that on? Yeah, basically, it turns out that we were doing that research in an experimental sense. We were designed to understand things, not necessarily just to focus on the kind of protein. That was kind of an afterthought as we were going along, so that's the first thing I should say. But plant protein doesn't work because it usually, in fact almost always, is lower in one of or two of the amino acids, so it's not as complete. I mean, animal proteins are very similar to our proteins. We're animals too. So when we're consuming animal proteins, we have a nice profile of amino acid right there to do the work efficiently. Plant proteins, with one of them being down or two being down, it slows things down. That's point number one. Also, secondly, animal proteins have some individual amino acids, like the sulfur amino acids, methionine, cysteine, if you're familiar with those, that when metabolized, they give rise to sulfate ion, which is an acidic ion. So in a way, animal proteins create a metabolic acidosis. That's one thing. That's not so good. Metabolic acidosis can lead to problems of osteoporosis. It can lead to other issues for other diseases. So there's a couple of ideas here. None is definitely proven, and I don't think there's one explanation, to be honest about it. It's the totality of the effect. Let me say one more thing about your question, though, I think you're referring to. Is it possible that we can increase plant protein higher and higher, maybe all the way up to 18 or 20%, and do we have a problem? The answer to that is no. And the reason we don't, not only because of the difference in the protein I just described, but as we do that with food, and protein is good, we consume high protein plant-based foods, as we go up, we may be getting more protein, which is not so bad, but even more importantly, we're getting a lot of antioxidant complex carbohydrates with it. That's nature. So in a sense, it's just controlling whatever theoretical difficulties that we might anticipate. Yeah, that's...
Io penso anche che possa essere legato.
I think it can be linked to the issue of inflammation. Animal proteins can lead to more inflammation in the human being, and it also can be linked to IGF, that is increase in insulinemia, excessive insulin compared to plant protein.
If you noticed one of my charts, we actually measured IGF, and that was one of the mechanisms. It was increased, and I think we were the first ones to actually have done that. That was many years ago, 25 years ago we did that. And in terms of inflammation, yes, it creates inflammation, which incidentally is a useful property, when the body is fighting infection, with the white blood cells. It's a little bit helpful, but like everything else, it gets in excess, when we consume an animal-based food.
Buongiorno, Raffaella Ciacchi da Trieste.
Good morning, Raffaella Ciacchi from Trieste. With regard to high protein content, can this lead in adults to the triggering off of autoimmune diseases such as spondylitis, which can be triggered off by one of the parents and their structure, or indeed their grandparent?
Yeah, we don't have enough information on that to really make a really definitive, conclusive answer, but the evidence we do have is highly suggestive. Namely, for the autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis, like rheumatoid arthritis, like type 1 diabetes, we have various kinds of evidence, and in all those cases, it turns out that a plant-based diet tends to suppress and actually reverses, if anything, those kind of diseases. I'm particularly interested on multiple sclerosis, which I had assumed during my career is a very progressive disease. And nothing has ever been discussed about diet having anything to do with MS. In reality, when we look at the data more carefully, and there was one gentleman who did a long-term study on that by the name of Roy Swank, he got some very suggestive data that suggested that a plant-based diet ought to be good to control progression of MS. And I've given lots of lectures, and I know more of the evidence we now have. I've had at least 15 people, I'd say, come up to me with MS, and sometimes emotionally with tears in their eyes tell me they tried this and it stopped it, in some cases actually reversed it. But unfortunately, those of us in science haven't really taken that seriously. But I'm really convinced personally that, yes, this should help autoimmune diseases. And there's some others too that I hear about. Again, we don't have the kind of evidence I'd like to see, published evidence. But on the other hand, this effect is so broad in what it does, operating maybe by different mechanisms for each kind of autoimmune disease. But for some reason, that's why I call this whole food plant-based diet a fact of nature. It's just nature at work. We eat the right food. The default position of the body, from my perspective, is to create health every microsecond at time. All we need to do is give it the resources to do that. And so I think this effect of the whole food plant-based diet is far-ranging, very broad. And I think we in science, in formal science, have just been too narrowly focused on things, and we don't see those things, but I'm really convinced we will be seeing lots of evidence for these autoimmune diseases.
Buongiorno.
Good morning. My name is Nadia Bolderini from Pordenone. I would like to give you my experience, sum it up. My daughter was born with a serious autoimmune disease. Traditional medicine didn't work. I started using organic food and my daughter got better. I began to study macrobiotics, blood groups. I'm studying traditional Chinese alternative medicine as well. And recently, I have been able to see that food isn't about chemical analysis only, vitamins and mineral salts and the like, but there's energy in food. It can be measured in various ways, and it has electromagnetic frequencies. Do you know about this, and what do you think about this?
Well, of course, there are many things I'm sure we obviously don't know about yet involving food. The chemical composition gives us a pretty good indication of whether the food is going to behave properly or not. On the other hand, we also know that, just as from traditional medicine, that people who take a drug, even though it might not be good, they can receive a so-called placebo effect. And that's something, whatever we're thinking about, our consciousness tells us that it's good when maybe it's not, but we benefit from a placebo effect. What those forces are, whether it's electromagnetic or whether it's neurological or hormonal, who knows? But I am certainly one person, have an open mind about that. I do not know about the electromagnetic properties of food as it relates to disease control or reversal. I hear about it sometimes, but I'm simply not familiar with the kind of evidence that I would like to see in the literature.
Before the next question, could I just reply to the other speaker we had who was asking about information to get things to change and passing on information? Well, the answer to that question, education, schools and the like, is yes, of course. We all do that in our respective roles as representatives in these institutions, events such as this one, for instance. We also, anytime we talk about legal provisions or measures, we always try to refer to these aspects and provide accurate information, because, of course, information means that the right information has to be passed on. And this should be done at all different levels. And what I can say is that in Europe, well, I was a rapporteur recently for a report on food education in schools, fruit, vegetables and milk in schools. And there is increasing attention given to these measures, but each and every one of us has to try to do his or her best at national level to ensure that all of this becomes part of the school curricula. Just like you have civics or physical education, I would have a few hours a week on food, not just for school children, but also for their parents. Because we shouldn't be left on our own. It isn't always easy to do the right thing. I know that Be for Eat are working a lot on that front as well, and I'll pass it over to Nicola. Yes, Be for Eat tried to work on schools from kindergarten right up to middle school. And we've started working on this. We always start at the beginning, at the grassroots level. It's quite difficult to move our way up, but we are getting into schools and passing on the right information. Very often, school children know more than we do, actually, because this is a subject which is of great interest to them. However, what is missing is how to put into practice what one hears. And we are looking for people to cooperate with us on this front, because there are many teachers who do wish to convey these concepts and pass on the message. And Be for Eat, along with volunteers and doctors, are beginning to work in schools. So, as I say, starting on this grassroots level, we are working our way up. Could I just point out that a study was carried out on 3,000 children in 2 villages close to Rome. We have schools involved as well. We were able to obtain information from this survey. We were able to ascertain that obesity was over 29%. We're now reviewing that study, which was carried out some time ago, and working on a sample. We were able to get that figure down by 10 to 15%, simply thanks to the fact that we passed on information. So it is true that the right information has to be passed on the basis of data. And all it required there was for information to be passed on to get that level of obesity down. So children now, rather than take a piece of pizza to school, are taking a piece of fruit to school. That's what we've got to do. We haven't got into schools yet, but we will. We need help from the institutions so that, yes, we must start at the grassroots level, but we really do have to work our way up through society. My name is Stefano Magno from Rome.
Visto che il tempo si sta...
Well, as we are running out of time, you, Stefano, and then a lady here, and then another lady, a young man, and then another young lady. Well, let's take all the questions together. Well, it's not a question really so much as a comment that I'd like the group to consider. As an oncologist, my experience is that you have to work from the grassroots level upwards. There's no doubt about that, because if we train doctors well, we'll get to results in 20 or 30 years' time. If we're dealing with today's graduates, that's too far away. But this cultural change doesn't just depend on the right sort of information being available at the grassroots. So above all, we have to create awareness in the first place. But then we have to do something to provide motivation, because people have an emotional link to their food. You know how difficult it is to persuade someone who has a breast cancer to give up milk, because the dairy products might have an impact on breast cancer. But as I say, there are these emotional links with certain foods. But if that someone who's been dealing with tumours. Well, I think obviously if someone's had a tumour, that's the right moment in their lives to bring about a change, and that people perhaps who've had cancer could be used to promote this idea of food habit changes. So I think a fundamental role could be given to associations of cancer patients. They could play a leading role in promoting this idea of change.
Allora, sono Olimpio.
Mr. Zanchetta, I come from Treviso. I'm in the 5-star movement. I'm going to play the devil's advocate here, knowing that on the long term, human selection also means that people have to go through periods of hunger and famine during migration periods. Human beings have been omnivorous because they had to eat anything in order to survive. And mankind had to eat what was available. It was a question of need and opportunity. But I'm talking now about thousands of years ago when people lived in tribes and then society was formed. But I think that history has had an impact on our food habits. But has that given rise to any doubt in the research that you've done? Why do people eat meat? Why for so long have we been dependent on dairy produce? Why is man dependent on these foods? What is there a historical link there? And if you're thinking about long-term developments, it's difficult, I think, to change habits. At the moment, of course, there's too much food available. And there's just too much food available. That is perhaps what leads to obesity problems. Thank you.
This is undoubtedly, obviously, an important observation you're making. We're very much aware of cultural changes over time and what impact this can have on dietary habits as well as on disease progression. We have lots of studies to show that if people move from one country where the risk of disease is high to where it's low, we see a change. I mean, that's the extent of the information we have now. It's very impressive, or from low to high. There is a concept that we call maladaptation. Namely, we can be experiencing the wrong kind of food for perhaps a long time, hundreds, maybe thousands of years. And actually adapt to it to some extent. We know that's true, but not totally. But even though those people who seem to have a really strong preference for and maybe long cultural history of doing it that way, when we take the people, with a strong background for that kind of thing, give them this kind of food, we see benefits. And so my, of course, career and my analysis of this information is simply look at the biology wherever people are. Some people are going to make major changes, could save their lives. Other people less so, maybe because they've been adapted, to this to some extent. So this is a very good point you make, but it's one of the reasons I say this is the goal that applies to everyone, regardless whatever may have been their cultural backgrounds, and just the extent to which people can go and reach that goal is, I think, a good way to look at it, without being too dogmatic about, being certain, 100% for everybody for all the time. Yes, but what is true, and we take people from various conditions, and they choose this kind of diet, they improve, regardless what have been their archaeological or anthropological history.
Sì, e il paragone.
Well, there's a typical comparison of the Eskimo who lives in an area with no plants, no vegetables. What does he do?
That was early data referred to, collected in the 1920s and 30s. Since then, some of my colleagues have actually shown that with better data, their problems are not too different from anyone else. And there's another group that we hear about as the Maasai in Africa, who live on blood, meat, and milk, and supposedly have no problems. Well, that was a story told in the 1950s and 1960s, and I had the first Maasai student to come and work on a graduate level with me at Cornell, and I sent her back to Africa. Her father was, in the medicine business, and to collect some more information. It turns out that they do not only live, as you probably know, on blood, meat, and milk. They also live on a lot of tubers and things like that. Then the man who first made the estimate that the Maasai had problems, that had the lower heart disease risk and so forth, he went back and analyzed a total of 73 people who had died from various kinds of injury. And he found out, and these are older men, he said that they had as much heart disease, cardiovascular disease, as old American men, as he put it. They just hadn't quite expressed it. It was in their blood vessels. It was clear. And probably the reason that it wasn't being expressed as much is because of their exercise. They really are traveling a lot. So on whether it's the Eskimos or the Maasai or some of the other indigenous groups, we need to spend more time to see if there's some exception that we need to know about and why.
Vi chiedo la cortesia le ultime.
Could we have the last three questions now? The lady first, the one lady at the back, and then I think we have to close because the room, we have to vacate the room. I have a question for Professor Campbell. Could you clarify something relating to oil and this ban on oil? I deal with cellular membranes. I've been studying these for a number of years, and I'd like to understand what sort of oil. Obviously, we have a wonderful Mediterranean olive oil, and we think it's very high quality. It's a very good condiment, but olive oil we think is crucial for the structure of our cellular membranes. So, could you clarify the indications that you would give on oil, or indications you've seen on the use of food oils?
My answer is unfortunately rather complex. There's various kinds of oil, as you know, and the monounsaturates or olive oil, for example, is one kind. Then we have the saturated fats and the unsaturated fats, okay? And they all have different properties. We know all of those three. Also we had to make a distinction between the oil that's added, the refined oil out of the context of the whole food, compared to the oil that's present in the whole food. That's another distinction. So you had to put all these ideas together. In the United States, most of the added oil is a problem, pretty serious problem, because in that case it's mostly omega-6, it's pro-inflammatory, it occupies much of the energy space and therefore leads to a reduction in consumption of whole plant-based foods. The saturated fats, not as bad as the polyunsaturated, by the way, but still occupy a large proportion of the total. The monounsaturates, the olive oil, I know is of interest here in Europe, great interest, but the evidence indicates that it's not quite as bad as the saturates or unsaturates, if you will. But I was actually at the initial conference that was making determination of the value of olive oil. It was at Harvard University in the early 1990s. And so we had some chance to compare. There's something that wasn't told very much. The heart disease, breast cancer, and colon cancer rates are somewhat reduced, of course, as you know, in the Mediterranean countries. That's very clear, and I think it's pretty reliable. But it doesn't come down to as low as what we see in rural China, where total oil consumption is much lower. There's quite a huge difference. And in fact, in the recent Predimed study from Spain that you may be familiar with, in that case, they compared over a period of 8 years a large number of people on a Mediterranean diet with nuts in one arm and with olive oil in the other arm, and sure enough, they saw a decrease. It wasn't, in some cases, it wasn't statistically significant, but nonetheless, it was there. It was quite a bit. But still, the decrease that is seen is still not nearly as low as what we see in rural China. So I don't know what else to say. I mean, so we need to do more work on that question. I'm not convinced, and I know I'm saying this to an audience that may really strongly disagree with me on this, but I'm not saying that the oil necessarily contributes to health. It minimizes health problems. In some cases, yes, it can contribute to health, I guess in some cases, at least compared to the unsaturated and saturates. But so we need more discussion on that, really more discussion on that. And I think one of the things we do, whether it's olive oil or corn oil or anything, we become addicted to high oil intake. Really, we do suffer addictions to high fat and high oil intake. And that's what we want, that's what we desire, we become attached to it. And what we find in these trials is that people go off the added oil, they acquire a different taste. And so any kind of oil then becomes somewhat difficult. And that's been shown in some published data on that, by the way. That it takes about a month or maybe 2 months for some people, if they go down to less or no added oil, to acquire this new taste. It's a new world. It's a new experience. So olive oil, yes, is definitely, the evidence suggests it's certainly better than what we use in the West. But I think the whole olive is probably the gem. That's the gold nugget. That's with all the oil it has in it.
No, solo ripetere un attimo. Io penso.
Well, I think that we should be thinking about striking a balance when it comes to the amount of oil and fats in food without imposing a complete ban. I think we should give advice about the balance between polyunsaturates and monounsaturates, but especially when we're giving health advice, promoting grains, we had to realize that there's omega-6 and some unsaturated fats in cereals, which can have an inflammatory effect.
The concept I'd rather like is to talk about a goal, based on the science that I can defend, a goal, and the extent to which people approach the goal, right, is a choice that involves more than their awareness of science. We know that. So it's a choice that depends on various factors, cultural factors, obviously, and taste preferences and so forth. And so if I think so, this is the kind of goal, and some people may not have to go quite to that goal to get all the health that they need. So we just got to be aware of that. It's hard to make generalizations for everyone, in an absolute sense.
Sì, buongiorno, sono Andrea Pacagnella.
Good morning. My name is Andrea Pacagnelli. I come from a small municipality of Brescia from the Five-Star Movement. Could I just make the following point, which will end up with a question which links up with what has just been said. It has to do with palm oil. Now, I don't want to start discussing the ins and outs of palm oil. We don't have enough time to do that, and you've already replied to that in part, Dr. Campbell. But what I'd like to say is that in terms of what happened, well, I'd like to speak about what happened in Italy with regard to palm oil. Since doubt has been cast on the use of palm oil and how healthy it is, public opinion has been able to get things moving. I work in a supermarket, and I've seen that people buying products have a closer look at the small print and go to see if there's any palm oil in the product. So this links up to what we saw earlier on in the documentary. The suggestion is that you start off really at the grassroots level to try to then pass on the message to those in charge of government. I think that we all do our shopping, and when we do our shopping, we've got to be careful about what to do is to work on the big companies, on the major companies, and what they market, what they produce and what they market. We mustn't forget the importance we have as consumers. We have clout as well. We're voters, and citizens have many other functions in life, and we can therefore bring our pressure to bear on the lobbies to make sure that they do what we believe to be most appropriate. Last two more questions, the last two. My name is Nicoletta De Bellis. I come from Pordenone. I would like to link up to the whole canteen issue. Now, school canteens, meals in schools. Now, I know all about this. I have two small children, and something is being done about this, fortunately. But also canteens in hospitals, where there's very, very little awareness. Now, we know that the companies who win the public contracts, the ones who put forward the lowest bids, are the people who win, and the quality of the food, therefore, is really dreadful. I had a relative recently in hospital who explained that the food served was really of poor quality and simply inedible, which is really a waste of food at the end of the day, because people simply refuse to eat the food which is served up to them. Now, close to Pordenone, there is an oncology center, a research center, where various cures are being studied. But I don't think that food ever comes into the picture. And here, too, I believe that there is potential room for improvement. Information could be passed on there, too. Thank you very much.
Campbell, I'm here on your right here. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your speech. I have a very short question. It's about what's about of eating fish, because I know fish is not a plant, but my question is if eating fish has the same impact on the human body that of using and eating animal proteins. Thank you.
These questions, all these seem to relate to a central theme of consumer choice, I think, to a great extent, and I understand your comment on that. You know, and I respect that. We are individuals. We are influenced by various factors, family factors and social factors to cause us to make choices. But I would say this is true, certainly in countries that have big marketing campaigns. The public tend not to know the possibilities as far as this nutrition is concerned. And what I find really difficult to comprehend is that looking at this question historically, in the last 50 to 100 years, marketing has become a very powerful force, as you know. So if the public doesn't know all the possibilities, unless we assume that the consumer is a rational person, that if the public doesn't know this, how can they make really good choices for themselves? So it really raises the question, who's going to tell the public? And at the present time, I haven't been in policy development for a couple of decades in Washington and elsewhere. I can tell you that there are active, or I should say, proactive efforts by industries who feel that their product may be questioned. There's proactive efforts to discredit this information. And there are generally also active efforts on the part of government officials to not allow this story to be told. So I have a particular passion that the public gets to know this and make their own decisions. Informed choice is really important. We're not getting informed choice now like we should. That's one issue that's really important. Canteens and hospitals, yeah, I mean, we can insist on changes very clearly, and there are some hospitals in the United States that are beginning to change, changing the whole array. I know that some hospitals, some of the worst food you can find in the community is in the hospital, or the food that's offered to patients after recovering from surgery, for example. That's changing. I see a lot of evidence of people now talking about changing that, making an effort to change it. Fish, Yeah, I think the fish question is interesting. I'm often asked that question. If you take the protein out of fish and compare it to the protein of other animals, for example, and that was done, fish protein is just like other animal proteins. In terms of raising cholesterol, generating heart disease. Also, fish have a problem in the sense that they don't have the antioxidants, the complex carbohydrates that are available in whole plants. So on that ground, and fourthly, I should say, some fish are unfortunately contaminated with heavy metals like mercury and pesticides. So there's several strikes against the consumption of fish. On the other hand, on the positive side, there's a fish in the deep waters that do have some advantage in the fact that they have more of the omega-3 fats, compared to the omega-6s. And omega-3 fats are useful if we're consuming a high omega-6 diet and we want to get minimize some of that effect. You put some omega-3s in there. So we actually do see some evidence that fish of certain kinds with omega-3 can, attenuate that effect to some extent. Overall, I used to say that if there's an exception to my opinions on this, it's fish, maybe from the deep water ocean, and yogurt, by the way, which is a fermented product. I don't know, school is out, you have to help me on this, but I think that occasional fish, the right kind, in theory, I'm not a black and white kind of person in this, but occasional fish is, I don't see any evidence against it. Yeah. Did I touch all the questions? Leave something out?
Sì, grazie. Lascio l'ultimo.
Thank you very much. I'll give the last word to Nicola Signorelli. Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I attend meetings such as this one quite frequently. They're important meetings, but could I call on you and on your sense of responsibility? Something must emerge from this meeting, and something will if you bring something home, because we have the scientific evidence there, and we can all individually do something. We've got the whole canteen issue, be the canteens in schools or in hospitals. We've got the whole issue of training physicians. All of us can help improve these areas. We've got that scientific evidence, which is out there now. And hopefully people listening to us will not simply just keep all of this information to themselves, but talk about this subject to other people. And that's how we'll move on and forge ahead. What has been possible so far has been possible thanks to the fact that individual citizens have done something. And that's what we must continue to do, because otherwise meetings such as this one are pointless. Thank you.
Io e anche Eleonora.
Well, Eleonora and myself would like to thank Nicola Signorelli for attending. It was a great honor to have you, Professor Campbell, as our guest today, and hopefully this will be just another of many future steps which will be taken towards informed choice and nutrition. So thank you very much for attending, and all the very best to you.